It is 7 o'clock. Good to see you this Wednesday morning. And indeed, we have not one but two big breaking stories for you. How much more are we going to get squeezed? The latest inflation figures are out shortly. And why is there anger over the compensation for victims of the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS, the infected blood scandal? We'll be getting reaction from a survivor and indeed from the Senior Cabinet Office Minister, Kit Malthouse, in just a few moments' time. Plus, are you a grafter? We'll be asking Liz Truss supporter Sajid Javid about a comment from the Tory leadership favourites that's not had the best reception. It is Wednesday, 17th of August.
Could inflation be about to hit double digits? We'll have the very latest figures shortly, and I'm here in one of the most deprived parts of England to find out how people here are coping.
Anger and disbelief. The government offers compensation to the victims of the infected blood scandal, but others affected will be missing out.
How can they have this differentiation and this hierarchy between bereaved families? I mean, all their lives matter just as much as the next person.
A wee dram of criticism. Liz Truss called grossly offensive after a leaked recording reveals her saying British workers need more graft.
What needs to happen is, to me, a bit more graft. It's not a popular message.
Spiteful and sanctimonious. Donald Trump hits out at Republican Liz Cheney after she loses her seat in Congress. We'll be telling you why.
A route to safer roads or just far too many rules? Could cyclists soon be forced to have number plates and insurance?
Weather warnings with more rain on the cards. We'll be taking you through the latest flood alerts. Also ahead on the programme. Charismatic and funny tributes to the singer Darius, who's died at the age of 41, but mystery surrounds the nature of his demise. And shining the spotlight on COVID, we'll be focusing on the pandemic at 9:30, speaking to the World Health Organization and an author about her long COVID recovery. Morning all. We begin, as advertised, with some breaking news. The latest inflation figures are out. Our business correspondent, Helen-Ann Smith, is sitting directly opposite me with them in her hands. So what are we learning? I suspect it's not good news.
I'm afraid it is yet more terrible news. Another really big jump in the rate of inflation to 10.1% inflation was in the 12 months to July. 10.1%. That is the first time we have seen inflation in double digits since the 80s, since the early 80s, another 40-year high. I say this every month, and we've been doing this for about 11 months in a row now. 11 months in a row we've had above target inflation. We have to remember the target that we would like inflation to be is about 2%. So 10.1%, it really is huge, and we are all feeling it in our day-to-day lives. There's some real drivers to it. It's food, it's fuel. Those are the two really, really big ones. But what I think is really frightening about this is we are, although it might not feel like it, in a slight calm before the storm moment at the moment, because when those energy prices go up, as they will in October, things are going to get worse. The energy price cap, I mean, the forecasts just change every few days, up and up, could be as bad as in excess of £4,000 a year, in excess of £4,500 a year by the spring. I mean, really big numbers. We've had news today that the gas prices in Europe are going up again because of the low levels of water in the Rhine, people trying to build up their stock. So all of these factors means things are probably going to get a lot worse in the autumn. There could well be a recession. I hate to be such a doom and gloom mongerer, but it really is a bleak picture this morning.
Helen-Ann, we'll have much more from you throughout the programme on this particular topic. For now, thanks very much. Now, it has been called, justifiably, the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. The thousands of people infected with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood products in the 1970s and 80s. Well, this morning, compensation has finally been announced for survivors and spouses. But there's anger from some children and relatives of those affected who will be missing out. Our home editor, Jason Farrell, has our first report.
My name's Andrew Evans. I was infected through haemophilia treatment at the age of 5 with HIV and hepatitis C. I developed full-blown AIDS at the age of 16 and barely managed to survive to the age of 20.
Andrew is one of an estimated 4,000 victims who survived what's been labelled the worst treatment disaster in NHS history, where patients were infected with HIV and hepatitis C through contaminated blood products. It's thought around 2,400 people died. Many suffered in silence because of public attitudes to HIV.
The stigma was still so strong against those people, frightened me to death. And so I kept everything completely under wraps as far as that was concerned. I told nobody at school. I didn't tell even my best friends about it until it became absolutely apparent that there was, something going on, that I was ill and I couldn't hide it anymore.
The evidence I shall give
shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
After decades of campaigning, an inquiry was launched in 2018. Former health secretaries and a prime minister gave evidence, no one accepting blame or the argument for compensation.
What had happened to them was incredibly bad luck.
But campaigners say it was incompetence, reckless blood collecting methods in the US and a lack of checks when imported to the UK. The inquiries recommended compensation, and now the government has announced each victim will get £100,000.
Obviously, it's a very welcome sum of money. If you split £100,000 over 40 years of being infected, it's £2,500 a year. It will help at the moment for me personally to do what I want to do most, which is to secure my family's future. But I'm also very aware of the people that this doesn't deal with at the moment.
I'm Lauren Denise Palmer, and I lost both my parents back when I was 9 years old.
Lauren was orphaned by the scandal. Her father was given infected blood and died of AIDS in August 1993. He unknowingly infected her mother, who died in the same month. While spouses of victims will get compensation, parents who lost children or children who lost their parents won't get a payout.
How can they have this differentiation and this hierarchy between bereaved families? All their lives matter just as much as the next person. I haven't been able to lead a normal life as such, where I've got the stability of having two parents for support and to go through education and go to uni, be able to stay at home long enough to save, to put a deposit on a home. So I haven't done any of that.
This is a victory for people like Andrew, but decades late. And many, like Lauren, who've suffered, are still waiting for recognition. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
A very significant day. Let's discuss it with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, Kit Malthouse. Mr Malthouse, lovely to see you. Look, we've certainly got plenty to talk about in terms of the way the scheme is being administered, when the payments will start going out. But I wonder if we might start by just giving you the opportunity to speak directly to the victims of this scandal and indeed those who have been bereaved by it. This was something that just simply should never have happened.
Oh, look, without doubt, it is a dreadful episode that has had a very profound impact on too many people, and some of the stories certainly that I've read have been tragic. I mean, the report which led to this payment today includes the testimony of a number of people who've been deeply, profoundly affected in their lives by this event, and it's very, very moving. And so it's, as I say, while money will never compensate for what's happened, I'm pleased that we're able to make these payments today.
Given the huge pressures on the kind of the nation's finances at the moment, why has the government chosen this particular moment to finally move forward on Sir Robert Francis's recommendation?
Well, it became clear during the early part of the inquiry that was set up in 2017 that the impact on people had been such that compensation was going to be payable. So my predecessor, Penny Mordaunt, commissioned Robert Francis to have a look at the framework for compensation. Out of that came the notion that because of the urgency of this matter and the fact that, frankly, people were dying, that we needed to make an interim payment. That went to the main inquiry, to Brian Langstaff, who made a recommendation which we've complied with fully. And so we're announcing today that we're going to make those interim payments of £100,000 to those infected and bereaved partners, and we'll be making that payment by the end of October.
I mean, you mentioned urgency there. I mean, given the fact that people are dying at the rate of, 1 every 4 days, those who are affected by this urgency, it is of the essence that this gets done as soon as possible. So why then, many of those who are affected by this are asking, are they going to potentially have to wait until the end of October?
No, so at the end of October is the deadline by which everything has to be paid, so the money may flow more quickly than that. Obviously, the advantage of what Sir Robert and Sir Brian have proposed is that there's a current support scheme on which all these people are enrolled that is making payments to them of varying degrees to deal with their care. That allows us to identify those individuals quickly and make the payment quickly. So my October date is a deadline by which the payment has to be made. Hopefully it will be made much earlier.
Why has it taken, though, and you don't need to delve very deeply into the inquiry to find people who feel that this process has taken far, far too long. Sir Robert Francis's recommendations, as I recall, were handed to the government back in March. You had the chair of the inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, suggesting at the end of July that interim payments were to be made. We are in a situation, and I understand that you are committing to get this done as soon as possible, but you're also suggesting that people may well have to wait months to receive this payment. Why is it taking so long?
No, so you're right that Robert Francis reported earlier this year, but that then went to the main inquiry. He appeared, I think, in July in front of the inquiry, and the responses came to us at the beginning of July. We've moved as quickly as we possibly can to get all the complexities, if you like, of making this payment through to make sure it's not going to affect people's eligibility for welfare, that it won't affect their taxation situation, all those kind of issues. We're now in a situation where it's been approved, it's through the Treasury, we can start to make the payments as quickly as possible. So, look, we're very apprised of the need for urgency on this. As you said, estimates are that somebody's dying every 4 days.
Someone died last Thursday.
Exactly. So we need that money to flow as quickly as we possibly can, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks.
But again, just in terms of the chronology of all of this, some are suggesting that what the government is trying to do here is in essence, minimise its liability, and in the most brutal, horrible way possible. They're suggesting that people are dying, of course, at a rate of 1 every 4 days. That could be 20 dead by the end of October. Robert Warwick is an example of all of this. Quoted this morning in The Guardian, he was infected with HIV and Hep C. He says this: the government have held off as long as they can, simply because the more people die, the less they will have to pay out in the end, so the scandal continues. Speak directly to Richard.
Well, I'm afraid that's... I understand why people are anxious about the time frame, but I'm afraid that's not correct. And to be honest with you, there's a very dedicated team at the Cabinet Office who've been pushing very hard to make sure that we get all the T's crossed and the I's dotted so that we can get this money out as quickly as possible. Part of my job has been to drive that through with them, through government over the last month. We now have to make sure that we get that money out as quickly as we possibly can. We're all apprised of the urgency, and I understand after, for some people, a 40-year campaign to get to this point, that they're anxious and impatient now for the money to be out, and we will do what we can to get out as quickly as possible.
Just be absolutely clear, are you saying that this process has been carried out at every point as quickly as it possibly could?
Yeah, certainly, I came into the job, a month ago, and I've seen nothing but alacrity from the team, and we've been pushing hard in every department. DHSC, the Treasury have all moved at speed to get this money flowing, £400 million, as quickly as we possibly can. We're now in a position where we're able to pay it, as I say, to those who are infected and indeed to bereaved partners. But don't forget, Neil, this is an interim payment, right? So there's a contemplation, particularly in the framework that Sir Robert produced, that in future, when the inquiry finally concludes, which we think will be next year, we'll then be able to contemplate what more we morally need to do.
Just in terms of that moral obligation, Lauren Palmer, who you saw in her report there, she lost both her parents when she was just 9 years old. What about people in her situation? What about parents who lost their children? I mean, we know that successive governments have, in essence, lied to cover up what was the most fundamental scandal within our health service. It seems pretty clear that those individuals, like Lauren, deserve some form of compensation. Can you give an assurance today that they will be getting something at some point?
So the claims that you make and the eligibility and the scope of where this terrible scandal impacted and what should then happen is exactly what Sir Brian Langstaff is looking at in his inquiry. Now, it will be wrong for me to prejudge that. That will come out next year. He's due to conclude, as I say, in 2023.
I understand.
And once he has,
but it's not the position of the lawyers representing the victims. This is what they've said. The infected blood inquiry continues its good work under Sir Brian Langstaff. However, it would be frustrating if the victims have to wait for the inquiry's final report before a meaningful compensation mechanism is put in place. They continue. They have already waited decades, and this is the key point. Any argument that we need any more evidence of the fact the government must be held to account is now untenable. We know that the government is responsible. We know that these people need compensation. Why can't we simply move forward with
Well, that's why we're making interim payments. Now, you know, we saw the need for that early on in the inquiry. That's why we got Sir Robert Francis to put together this report on a framework for compensation payments. And while he's obviously recommended interim payments, that framework is good for future compensation payments as well. We have to wait for the inquiry to conclude. As I say, infected and bereaved partners will get this money quite quickly over the next few weeks, and then we'll be able to consider, once the inquiry is concluded, the more complicated questions about wider eligibility and what, if any, compensation should be payable.
Of course, the victims of infected blood, they're not the only people who are desperately seeking compensation. So what about those who've been affected by Primados, Valproate and Mesh? The Cumberledge Review 2 years ago recommended that they deserved compensation, and still the government is sitting on its hands. Since then, 23 members of the Primados campaign have died. When will they get compensation?
Well, as I say, today we're concentrating on the infected blood scandal. We'll have to consider more widely these medical events from past years. But I'm happy to look at that situation as well and see what can be done.
It just feels, again, given the complaints about the length of time it took for the inquiry to even be set up, then for the inquiry to move forward, then having had this interim report passed, having had this compensation report passed to the government, then an argument at the end of it, just feels again that the government is dragging its heels. And when people are genuinely dying, week after week after week because of mistakes which were avoidable, these are people who will never receive the compensation that they were due.
Well, look, there's no doubt about it that the many years of campaigning that lots of people put in should not have had to happen, right? There should have been, as far as I could see, an early acknowledgement that there had been an issue, that a tragedy, that a scandal had unfolded. In 2017, obviously, the government did recognise that and instituted the inquiry. We're now moving to fulfil the recommendations on interim payments as quickly as we possibly can, having recognised early on that this was likely to be the case. My job now is to drive that through and make sure the money gets into people's hands as quickly as we possibly can. But look, there are more complicated circumstances than we are currently addressing around eligibility, not just infected and bereaved partners, but there are others, as you said, parents, children, other relatives. Now, that is more complicated, as Sir Brian Langstaff has said in his inquiry, and we will get to them in the end. As remember, this is an interim position. And I'm pleased
get to them in the end. I mean, that's the assurance that people are looking for.
Well, certainly that's where the inquiry is going, right? So when Sir Brian made the recommendations to the government, which we're fulfilling today, he did acknowledge that there would be disappointment in some other groups, that it was more complicated to work out eligibility and scope with them, but that in time we would get there.
Can we talk about the big major news, the other breaking news this morning, of course, inflation, CPI hitting 10.1%. I mean, your response to that, pretty grim times, but also perhaps comment from you on why we have to wait until the 5th of September to find out what this government is going to do about it.
Well, look, obviously the whole of the developed world is struggling with inflation at the moment, as you know, caused by global energy price shock and supply chain difficulties, and not least the war in Ukraine. So it's a struggle for everybody. But it wouldn't be right to say that the government is sitting on its hands. I mean, as you know, we've got £37 billion now flowing into people's pockets. Which
has pretty much been wiped out, that which we've just seen in terms of the inflation increase.
But a lot of that is...
There is a desire to see here, right now, what the government is going to do. We're in limbo for 3
No,
months.
I understand that, but much of that is yet to land, right? So the support payments that will flow out, I mean, in total, there'll be about £1,200 to a third of households across the country at the lower end of the pay scale who will get that assistance. There's obviously money that will be flowing later this year to pensioners, to people with disabilities, and there'll be money flowing generally through bills to support people across the economy. We're obviously in a political transition period, so when a new Prime Minister arrives, they will have to make some decisions about if any or what any further support mechanisms might be.
There's no other country on earth where the senior members of the government are literally sitting on their hands.
Well, but see, you keep saying that, and that's not true either. So, I had a meeting just last week with Nadhim Zahawi, Chancellor of the Exchequer, to talk about the different elements of the economic package that might be available to a Prime Minister while the current 37 billion flows out, so they're able to make decisions quickly. Alongside that, don't forget, we're still running our Help for Households campaign. They're working with the private sector to see what they can do to assist. There's lots of work ongoing, A, to get ourselves in shape, but B, to promote and push out the current support schemes, which are pretty huge by our standards.
What is the Prime Minister's level of involvement in any of this?
Well, as I say, the Prime Minister, I think he was at the meeting with the fuel companies, the energy companies, just last week.
That was between his holidays, yeah.
To monitor what they're doing. He's staying in touch and being briefed by his staff at Number 10, I would imagine.
Mr Motley, it's a busy day for you. We'll let you crack on. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks a lot.
Let's have a quick look at some of the papers, and we start with the FT. It shows official figures. The real terms wages are falling at their fastest rate for 20 years, which likely means that inflation won't be coming under control anytime soon. British workers need more graft, says Liz Truss. That's on the Guardian front after the emergence of that controversial audio clip. We'll be discussing that a little later. Well, the Express has Liz Truss attacking EU bosses for breaking a research agreement, in her view, to punish the UK over Brexit. The Times, meanwhile, leads with Rishi Sunak turning on Liz Truss over the cost of living, warning that her plans to ease the crisis will tip millions of people into destitution. Plenty coming up on a very busy Wednesday on the programme. A year on since the Taliban returned to power in Afghanistan, I'll be joined by a female former Afghan MP to discuss what the future holds for the country's women and girls. Shortly after 8, Labour's Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper will be here to discuss Labour's response to the cost of living crisis. And a little later that hour, the Managing Director of Iceland, Richard Walker, will be here to discuss the supermarket's new ethical food credit scheme. Donald Trump has hit out at the Republican Liz Cheney as spiteful and sanctimonious after she lost her seat in Wyoming to a candidate backed by the former president. Our international affairs editor, Dominic Wagner, has the detail.
In a farm in Wyoming, the Cheneys came to accept defeat. Liz Cheney, the latest and most high-profile Republican victim of Donald Trump. She has lost her seat, but she says the fight against him has only just started.
This primary election is over, but now the real work begins. I have said since January 6th that I will do whatever it takes to ensure Donald Trump is never again anywhere near the Oval Office, and I mean it.
Liz Cheney's been an implacable opponent of Donald Trump and voted to impeach him and has now paid the price. Her opponent in this conservative rural state repeated Trump's lie the election he lost was rigged. In turn, he came here to campaign against Liz Cheney and predicted this outcome.
And it's why in 2 months from now, the people of Wyoming are going to tell her, Liz, you're fired. Get out of here. Get out of here.
But Cheney's defiance in defeat is increasing speculation she might take him on herself. Liz Cheney has stopped short of saying she'll run for president in 2024 against Donald Trump, but she's using this defeat to renew her fight against him. And her team say she believes it could make her stronger. The Wyoming election has again underlined the strength of the Trump faction among Republicans. His supporters want him to announce he's running soon. Behind the wheel of his customised 71 Pontiac, Bob Ferguson says it's just a matter of time.
All the stuff that's happened since he's been out of office has probably convinced him more and more that he wants to be president again and wants to redeem what's been done against him.
Cheney's defeat shows the power of Trump even from the sidelines and the Republican Party's divisions as potential battle lines start to be drawn ahead of the 2024 election. Dominic Waghorn, Sky News, Wyoming.
Well, after hearing the results, Donald Trump took to his Truth Social app, congratulating the winner, and guess what? Hitting out at Liz Cheney. This is a wonderful result for America, he says, and a complete rebuke for the unselect committee of political hacks and thugs. Liz Cheney should be ashamed of herself, the way she acted, and her spiteful, sanctimonious words and actions towards others. Now she can finally disappear into the depths of political oblivion, where I am sure she will be much happier than she is right now. Thank you, Wyoming. I think Donald Trump may well be off Liz Cheney's Christmas card list. But let's turn our attention to the weather. Forecasters are warning torrential rain and thunderstorms could hit parts of England and Wales today. A yellow weather warning for thunderstorms is in place from Peterborough to Birmingham and through to the southwest of Wales. The Met Office says there is potential danger to life from flooding, and heavy rain in parts could cause disruption to transport systems and possibly power cuts. Well, these are some of the latest pictures we have from across the UK. After torrential rain, one resident in Loughborough managed to capture this photo of cars surrounded by water in their local supermarket car park. The flooding also caused disruption in Wales. In Port Talbot, houses were damaged by water and cars became trapped by the flooding. A similar story in Ireland. Roads there were left damaged by flooding in New Ross, County Wexford. And a young boy, you can see here, battling with an umbrella, very patriotic umbrella on the South Bank, just a short distance from where we are in Westminster. But let's leave the weather. Plenty instead to talk about in the Tory leadership race this morning after last night's hustings and a leaked recording of Liz Truss saying that British workers need more graft. Let's speak to one of her supporters, the former Chancellor, former Health Secretary, Sajid Javid. Mr Javid, lovely to see you again.
Good morning.
Can we start, of course, we have just had in the past few minutes the latest CPI inflation figures, 10.1%, eye-watering, and we know the direction that it apparently will continue to carry on. Given the fact we are 3 weeks away from the next leader of the Conservative Party, the next Prime Minister being announced, shouldn't Liz Truss start talking rather more explicitly today about what she intends to do to deal with the cost of living crisis?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd say we don't know who's going to win this leadership race. I mean, I hope it's Liz Truss. I think they're both great candidates, by the way. Like any party member, I've got to pick one. I've picked Liz. I think she's got the best plans for the future. So that's the first thing. That said, of course, both candidates, but especially Liz, has been setting out what her plans would be on this most important of issues, fixing our economy, dealing with
doing is mentioning what any of the measures would be in the emergency budget, which she tells us will be coming, but she won't tell us anything that will be in it.
Well, I think she's already said a few things that will be changes when it comes to the economy. So, for example, the tax cuts, and I think they are especially important for long-term growth. We can't tax our way into growth, and she's set that out.
It's the short-term cost of living crisis that's the problem, though. And the measures that she's announced, including the rollback on the national insurance increase, they do nothing for the poorest and
Well, she's also announced she's going to freeze the energy levies on bills for at least a year, and that will help. But I think she's also recognised that a lot more will have to be done, and the right way to do that is that if you become Prime Minister, is then to, with your team, then is to sit down and work out, taking into account the latest picture, the latest evidence. We'll have more information, for example, on the price cap by then, and to decide, but to do it very quickly. And she's absolutely right to say there will be an emergency budget. I would assume the Treasury is already working on plans from an incoming new Prime Minister. They will present those to Liz and her team, and she will act very quickly, and that's what's going to matter.
I'm just concerned that perhaps the situation isn't tenable over the course of the next 3 weeks, particularly given the fact you have seen, the heather being settled out with the Labour Party's announcement on an energy cap freeze. It's over 70% of Conservative members, apparently, support it as a policy. So you've got the opposition coming out with concrete policies, and you've got Liz Truss, touring the country, admittedly, speaking speaking to party members, admittedly, but repeating the same stuff over and over again.
Look, you know, when you're in opposition, you're never going to be held accountable for what you say, so you say what sounds good. I mean, I listened to what Keir Starmer had to say yesterday. I don't think his numbers added up at all. You know, Liz is campaigning to be Prime Minister, and if she wins, she has to deliver on everything that she said. So she's thinking very carefully about the commitments, rightly so. And she's made some solid commitments, but one of those clearly is to have this emergency budget, which, will, as I say, will happen within weeks, and to take further action. Nothing has been taken off the table because she recognises, as I do and as I think most politicians do, is that this is a very, very serious crisis for families at home. They would have looked at that inflation number today, and whilst it might not be a shock because of what the Bank of England said recently, that doesn't make it any less palatable to anyone. People will be worried, and Liz is going to be the right person to deal with this.
We'll have to wait then for the emergency budget, but perhaps just in ideological terms, you can tell me, I mean, which of the two does she prefer? Does she think that support should be blanket, as indeed Labour's policy is, or does she feel that it needs to be targeted specifically at those most in need?
I think you don't have to choose between the two. I think that if you look at the approach so far from the government, there's been a combination of a targeted approach to people on certain incomes. There's been an approach where everyone gets money off their energy bills. What she has said with the tax cuts, of course, that will benefit everyone. But you know, having a look at if targeted action can be taken, I'm sure that will be considered when it comes to the emergency budget.
Can we talk about the leaked recording that the Guardian have managed to obtain? In fact, we can probably bring it up and just
British
refresh.
workers produce less per hour and that's a combination of kind of skill and application. What needs to happen is, to me, a bit more graft.
What did she mean by that?
Well, look, that comment, as I understand it, was made a number of years ago. I don't know the exact context that was made in.
I understand that Liz Truss has changed her view on a variety of things over the years.
But what I also
mean?
heard her say, just in that snippet that you played there, was that the productivity in the UK versus other comparable countries is generally lower. And that's been a long-standing UK problem. And that doesn't happen because British workers don't work hard. British workers are amongst the hardest working in the world. I mean, I ran the health service, and I can tell you they could not work any harder in the health service.
Yeah, but it happens. Also said in that there was a difference in productivity between those working in and around the capital and those working in the regions. She appeared to be suggesting the problem with those in the regions is that they don't graft hard enough, when everyone else knows the reason that the South does better is because business and investment has been focused in this part of the country to the detriment of the rest of it.
I think what she's talking about is business and investment, because to increase productivity, the government, of course, has a huge role to play. There's capital investment, things like infrastructure investment, for example. Those areas that get more of it generally, of course, can do better in terms of productivity. It's also about skills investment and making sure that we're investing in skills across the country, not just in the capital or the southeast, but you're right across the country. And that is what's going to make the difference. And now Liz has a plan for that. But it all comes back to the economy, because if we don't increase our growth rate, we won't be able to pay for those investments. And that's why Liz has a plan that says, look, you've got to start with tax cuts to kickstart growth. And you've got to make a number of other changes, of course, alongside that. But it starts with tax cuts, and she gets that.
One thing that both Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak have studiously avoided committing to or even mentioning are the 40 new hospitals that we were hearing, that we first started hearing about from Boris Johnson back in 2019. Beth Rigby, our political editor, has done a bit of work showing that 80% of them either don't have a completion date or are unlikely to be finished by the next general election. Isn't it about time that we all just admit that 40 new hospitals was a nonsense?
No, of course not, because first of all, the commitment to 40 new hospitals is by 2030, not by the next general election.
Yeah, you would expect them to have a
the next general election is not in 2030.
You'd expect them to have a completion date, however.
You would expect that plan to be a plan in place that's going to lead to the 40 new hospitals by 2030. That plan does exist. Of course, it needs some updating, not least given the inflation figures we've just talked about. But Liz is committed to our manifesto, and that includes, of course, the record investment that we're seeing in the NHS.
How many of those 40 are new hospitals?
All 40 will be new hospitals. There's 20, alongside that, there's 20 hospital upgrades, which is more or less all of that's been done. There's 40 new hospitals, and that is the commitment in our manifesto, and that commitment will be kept by Liz.
Just one other topic, again, on journalism by one of my colleagues. Deborah Haynes has an exclusive story that the RAF has effectively paused recruiting white males to hit diversity targets. The head of RAF recruitment, in fact, resigning in protest at this effective pause. What do you make of that?
Well, first I'll say I haven't seen the detail of that story, but let me go, which is sometimes dangerous, so let me just go on what you said. I always take you at your word and you'll give it to me straight. And based on what you've just said, it sounds like complete nonsense. To me, I don't think any organisation, whether it's the RAF or any other public or private organisation, should be recruiting on the basis of one's race. Of course, we want to see a diverse workforce. We want to see all talents come through. And I happen to think having more diversity actually increases the productivity of your workforce, but it should not be based on race, whether it's black, white or anything else.
Sir Javid, lovely to have you in the studio. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks a lot.
Quick reminder that if you scan the QR code that will be appearing on your screen right now, you can listen to the latest edition of the Sky News Daily podcast. On today's episode, Chloe Culpin looks at the environmental promises made by both Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss in the battle for number 10 and asks where we're heading to next on the road to net zero. You can subscribe for free to the Daily, and you'll hear my voice on it again next week, wherever you get your podcasts. Tamara Cohen, our political correspondent, here in the studio as always. We've spoken on two issues, the leadership contest and indeed on infected blood with Kit Mollis and Sajid Javid. Your thoughts?
Look, inflation has hit 10% today, and if you're wondering what the person most likely to be our next Prime Minister, Liz Truss, is going to do to help people with their bills when it goes up and continues to go up in the coming months, all we're hearing is nothing is off the table. She really doesn't want to set out what kind of support people will get under her government, other than saying there will be an emergency budget at the end of September. She'll already be Prime Minister by then. If that happens, the decision will already have been made. We've heard so many different forms of wording from her supporters. Some people say she favours a more targeted approach. You heard Sajid Javid there saying you can do targeted, as we've done already. There's £650 going to the most vulnerable, but you can also do help for everybody. That sounds exactly like the sort of handouts that Liz Truss said she didn't like. There's also tax cuts, which, as has been pointed out by various people, benefit the wealthiest more. Even her opponent, Rishi Sunak, says millions of people could be at risk of destitution if Liz Truss does not give support or offer support to everybody who will need it. We heard some muted criticism of Labour's plan, saying perhaps the sums don't add up, not really attacking the principle of it.
It was a stronger attack, actually, on Labour's plans than I think we had from...
We have had, yeah, because they're trying to say, look, this is fantasy. Labour don't have to actually implement the policies they suggest. But look, at the moment, Liz Truss is still being studiously vague about what support she would give to people, allowing others to project their ideas onto her.
Tamara, thank you. Well, let's stick with those breaking inflation figures this morning. It is, of course, in double figures now at 10.1%. Fraser Mods joining us now from a community hub in Burnley, the Lancashire town, one of the hardest hit by the cost of living crisis. And I suppose these official figures, Fraser, just confirming what those who live where you are right now already know. Life is tough, and it's going to get a hell of a lot tougher.
It is indeed, sadly, yeah, the announcement of the figures today, 10.1%, isn't really going to change people's lifestyles from yesterday to today, just knowing what those figures are. Here in Burnley, highest inflation rate in the country, it's about 2.4% below that average of 10.1. It's about 3% lower than it is in London. So the people who use the church on the street here for the food bank, for the cafe, for the drop-in centre and so on, they're the hardest hit people in the hardest hit region of the country. And the man who runs this project here, Pastor Mick Fleming, just give us your thoughts on this. 10.1%, worse than the prediction, more bad news.
Yeah, it's dire, but what it's doing is it's creating a new poor. It's creating the working poor, and that's something that's very frightening. Because when you've got people that are actually working but can't sustain a month-to-month lifestyle just by eating, getting to work, travelling there, we're in trouble. We're in serious trouble.
So is that what you've noticed over the last months as this credit crisis, the cost of living crisis has hit us? It's the type of people who are using centres like this?
Yeah, the dynamics have changed, so there's far more old age pensioners, so we're catering for that, which we didn't have any, and more people who are working and they can't get to work, so they're having to come to Bristol help them with bus passes to get to work on the last week of the month. Things that you necessarily wouldn't think of. People can't get to the doctor's surgery because it's too far away and they're not well enough to walk. so they need bus fare. So, and everything's gone up, you know, everything's going up. It's not just the food, it's a knock-on effect that we're seeing, yeah.
Okay, Pastor Mick, thanks very much for talking to us. The cafe here opens in about an hour or so, and the flood of people will start coming in, about 1,000 people a week or so. They help here, and things are probably going to get worse than that pretty soon.
Fraser, many thanks. Now, cyclists may have to get a licence and insurance to ride their bikes soon, after the government has suggested it will tighten rules to bring them in line with car users and crack down on dangerous cycling. Joining us now, Sky's correspondent, Matthew Thompson. Matthew, don't step to your left, obviously. Just explain exactly what is going on here. This is the beginning of a consultation process. Call me an old cynic, but I've heard stuff like this from the government before.
Yes, this is basically the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, having given a couple of interviews to some newspapers this morning in which he said that he thinks that cyclists should be subject to the same rules and limits as motor vehicles on the roads, which raises the possibility that cyclists might soon find themselves getting licence points or fines for speeding and running red lights and the like. And it comes just a couple of weeks after the Transport Secretary also said he wants to create a new offence of causing death by dangerous cycling. But, Neil, there are two obvious flaws to this plan from the Transport Secretary. The first is the reason that speed limits are so easily enforceable against cars and the like is because, well, they've got number plates. So should cyclists have them as well? Mr. Shapps tells the Times he doesn't think so, but clearly some sort of identifying markers would be required. Otherwise, how do you enforce it? The second flaw is that, well, Mr. Shapps may only be the Transport Secretary for another 3 weeks. And let's say that announcing major new policy initiatives just weeks away from a cabinet reshuffle under a new Prime Minister is, at the very least, we might say, Neil, hostage to fortune.
Matt, thanks very much indeed. Let's take a quick look at some of the day's other headlines now. Sad story this, an elderly man riding a mobility scooter has been stabbed to death in West London. The attack happened in Caton Road in Greenford in Ealing at just after 4 p.m. on Tuesday. Met police officers were called to reports of a man with stab injuries. Despite the efforts of paramedics, he was declared dead at the scene. There have so far been no arrests. The former pop idol contestant and theatre star Darius Campbell-Dinesh has died at the age of 41.
Nobody warned me about your smile. You're the light when I close my eyes.
Well, the singer was found unresponsive in his Minnesota apartment. The cause of death is yet to be determined. The music mogul and former pop idol judge Simon Cowell paid tribute, calling him charismatic, funny and just a great person to be with. Some other famous faces have been paying tribute. Michelle Heaton says her thoughts are with Darius' family right now. Always our Brittany. And Nikki Chapman, one of the judges on those shows back in the day, she tweeted this to say, "A true gent with a kind soul and a mischievous twinkle in his eye. From that eventful first audition on Popstars to him kindly inviting me to see him perform on the West End stage." Now, a year after Afghanistan fell to the Taliban, some of those who worked there for the British are still in hiding there in fear of their lives. One former British Army interpreter has told Sky News that his life has become hell and called on the UK to help him escape. From the Afghan capital of Kabul, our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, has this report.
The checkpoints haven't moved. The blast walls and protective paraphernalia built by Western forces remain in place, now manned by the very people they were put there to stop. There's no war now, but the country remains on a war footing. Taliban special forces crisscross Kabul. The Islamic State bomb threat is a constant, but life here is relatively normal. Exactly a year ago, it was very different. We filmed the chaos of the evacuation of people who, lost in these crowds, had served the British government and military for 2 decades. People promised safe passage to the UK. Many never made it to the gates of the processing centre at the Baron Hotel next to the airport.
Well, it's obviously much quieter than it was exactly a year ago. This is the Baron Gate. This is the area that people were brought in to be processed by the British military, and this was the chaos outside the scenes here that basically shocked the world. It's still a restricted area. They don't really like you filming here at all. And just beyond here, you can see, and it's hardly changed in a year, the canal where a lot of people were killed in a suicide bomb attack, which basically brought this rather chaotic evacuation to an end.
With the Taliban fully in charge, hundreds, if not thousands, who are qualified to enter the UK are now effectively on the run, fearing for their lives. We won't name him, but this man served 5 years at Camp Bastion for the British military. He's still waiting for news of a plan to extract him. He's confused by the delay and he feels abandoned and overshadowed by another war.
1 year is a very long time. Just look at her. What's the difference between my blood, Afghan bloods, and Ukraine bloods? The Ukraine give 100,000 visa for them. They are war for 1 month, and still 1 year now ago. Why they all do this like with me?
Do you feel angry? Do you feel sad? What do you feel towards Britain?
I don't know, so I can explain to you, sir. My feeling is very bad. My life is now become like a hell. I don't know what should I do, where we can go.
Composed throughout our interview, he finally broke down when I said Sky News would try to help him and his wife and 2 children.
We can see if we can get the ball rolling.
I really appreciate it.
And we'll talk to our guys and they can talk to you.
I really appreciate it, just really kind of you, because I don't know what's happening the next day, the next year, the next tomorrow. I don't know. I love my family too much, my children. But now I can't do anything. I don't know what should I do for my life, for my family, where we going? Why they not help us?
1 year on, people like this interpreter are hiding in family homes, moving every month, unable to work, unable to send their children to school. Living in fear and waiting for instructions that they think may never actually come. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Kabul.
Well, here to give us their thoughts on what Afghanistan's future might well look like, one of its former MPs, Farzana Kocha. Farzana, lovely to have you on the programme this morning. You last spoke. You spoke to us back in August of last year, and you know you were very sceptical about whether or not the Taliban would stay true to its word on women and girls being allowed to carry on in education and work. You were right to be sceptical, weren't you?
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, what we saw in last 1 year is that we were right, and we are right. Taliban never cared about women and women's rights, human rights, and to their promises about keeping everyone safe and sound. So we just saw a report that says so many things.
What sort of life will Afghan girls have without that education, without the freedoms that they had before the return of the Taliban?
Before the return of Taliban?
No, I'm asking what is life like for Afghan girls at the moment, given the fact that they no longer have education, that they're being told whom to associate with, there is no prospect, indeed, of them being able to return to work?
I got it. Thank you. Sorry, I just went to another place.
Don't worry.
The report, it's obvious. Life for girls in Afghanistan and for women just became a hell. Like this man that you have had the interview with. There's nothing. Like looking at the families, society level, and the government level. There is nothing that women can have. Women do not have an economy in their household, do not have food, do not have medicine, do not have anything. They are going through so many things like violence. Women are the first, especially girls, who are facing the violence and who are paying the price for the poverty in all those economical situations. In the society, they do not have a place to go. They are being removed step by step, bit by bit. They are being removed from the society. They don't belong to those streets. They are told that you do not belong to here. And the institutions, the most important thing, that there is no address that women can reach and can go and to solve their problems. So the situation for women, like, we do not have a present. And by not having an education, which is the most important thing, that we do not have a future. If we do not have education, we do not have a present, and of course not a present. We do not, like, the only hope that we can have is to have an education and to be hopeful for the future, which we cannot see now.
Farzana, the West appears to believe that it can somehow force the Taliban to move on human rights and rights of women by withholding, the gold reserves, by holding the cash reserves, £600 million worth, $600 million worth held by the World Bank at the moment. The problem, of course, with that is, as you will well know, massive parts of Afghanistan are suffering now from malnutrition. There is a breakdown in terms of healthcare in the country. The country seems to be grinding to a halt.
Yeah, most of the sanctions or the policies that are now imposed on the Taliban are basically affecting the people's life. It's not about the Taliban. For example, if we just come out to something concrete and much beneficial that can be imposed on the Taliban is the travel ban. Why not the travel ban on the Taliban leadership, which can be just renewed by the 19th of August now? So they are always doing everything that they want, traveling. They have all the things and tools that they want and they need. But those things, that financial things that you mentioned, the sanctions, are basically affecting the life of the people. If we are doing things like the Afghan students are abandoned from the taking part in, especially just see the UK and the scholarships and so on, and people are suffering from the poverty and hunger in Afghanistan. But Taliban do not care about those things. They say they just clearly said that ask God for the food. We are not responsible for your needs and things that you should have. So these sanctions and these policies can be concrete and much more in a way that can influence or can bring a pressure on the Taliban, like the travel ban that I just mentioned.
Farzana, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but we are completely out of time. Thank you so much for talking to us. I think people will have appreciated your perspective on what's been going on. Thanks again. A little bit of breaking news to bring you. A hosepipe ban is to be brought in by Thames Water on August the 24th. We'll be bringing you news of where that will be in effect in the next hour, but it is my understanding that it will be pretty much in all of the areas that Thames Water supplies water to. No major shocks, no new announcements at last night's Tory hustings in Perth, but both candidates did dismiss the idea of a second Scottish independence referendum. Let's get a sense of how the race stands with under 3 weeks to go. Delta Poll's Joe Twyman back in the studio. Good to see you, Joe. So hustings taking place in Scotland, and of course there is a real question about what effect either leader might have on the push for Scottish independence. Mind you, I mean, everyone said Boris Johnson would be the biggest gift to Scottish independence, but still, we're not quite over the 50% line.
Yeah, that's right. It's difficult to know, given how little that both candidates have talked about Scotland, certainly prior to the hustings in Perth last night. It's difficult to see how either candidate would have a major impact on that. And there has been a poll of Scottish voters prior to the hustings, but that showed that actually, there was very little difference between the candidates. People are extraordinarily bad at predicting their own behaviour, particularly in hypothetical situations such as this. And what the poll results show is that actually the the Scottish people have a pretty low view of both candidates. That's what we can conclude from this.
But just to stick on this just for a second, I mean, I was speaking to an SNP MP yesterday, and I made the point to him that sometimes, you know, it often feels like the Conservatives are talked as if they're, you know, a non-entity in Scotland. I mean, that's not the case. 25% of the popular vote in 2019 in Scotland.
Absolutely, but the Scottish Conservative Party is, on many occasions, not least when it came to the latter days of Boris Johnson's reign. It was a very different party from the Conservative Party in Westminster, and so I think that's what we're seeing in the polls.
An astonishing bit of polling on our second screen here, and it seems like a majority of people, including Conservative voters, supporting the energy price cap freeze proposed by the Labour Party. I mean, this is staggering, 72%, wow.
Yes, but it's inevitably, of course, more complicated than that. This poll was commissioned by a campaign organisation who are campaigning for precisely that. But that doesn't mean that they're polling and this question is not legitimate, because it is a legitimate question. But what you're seeing is a reflection of the strength of feeling. People are very upset and also very worried about potential price rises in energy and indeed the cost of living more generally. And so solutions such as a cap, extending the cap at the current level, will inevitably prove popular.
Are you noticing any effects by the reticence of both camps in this to come forward, particularly Liz Truss, to be perfectly honest with you, to come forward with the concrete proposals for tackling the cost of living crisis? It seems that we're all having to wait until after September the 5th.
Yeah, it really doesn't surprise me at all. It's a really, really complicated and difficult situation. And because of the huge amount of money involved, there are no really good answers. There are only least bad answers. Now, people at home may be saying, oh, well, what about nationalisation like they did in France? Well, nationalisation cost France £8.5 billion to buy what was left of EDF, but they already owned 86% of EDF. So to nationalise the big five companies in this country, for instance, would have an enormous cost attached to it. And getting people to comprehend that is very, very difficult.
Joe, always great to have you in the studio, get your expertise. Thanks very much for joining us. Stay right where you are, of course. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, the infected blood scandal, a story that we'll continue to cover. But those inflation figures, CPI now at 10.1%. What could that mean for communities up and down the country? We'll be taking a look after this.